Who has a joke? I am going to start I'm going to start zeroing in on people. You never have to tell a joke, but okay, you've got one. Thank you. Oh, hold on. Hold on. First. You have a preference?
Preface.
Oh,
Do you know who Oedipus is?
Uh, do you know who Oedipus is?
That's not the joke.
Okay, just to be sure. So in the Greek tragedy, the gentleman who unwittingly kills his father and marries his mother,
Yes.
and
A very Freudian situation.
and Freud made a big deal of it.
Yes. Well, why doesn't Oedipus use foul language?
Why doesn't Oedipus use foul language?
Because well, he kisses his mother with that mouth. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. I won't talk much about Freud and his ideas about sexual development because well, I mean, the problem with Freud, let's see, he was a brilliant man. I read lots of Freud, right? Um, Brilliant man. The problem is he could explain anything, but he never tested anything. So whatever kind of dream you had, he could find a way to interpret it that would mean that you were lusting after your mother, right? Or whatever. Um, and the annoying thing is, I mean, it was never science, and never was falsifiable. But in some ways, he's had more of an impact on people's idea of psychology than anyone else. It's just in terms of psychology as a science, he's had no impact whatsoever. It's really his great contribution was recognizing the unconscious and the fact that many of the things we do we are not conscious of. But he was not the first person to talk about that. And yeah. Okay. Well, you brought him up, so that's why I got distracted there. So we've been talking about hormones, and we'd gotten this far talking about agonist drugs being those drugs that are enough like the endogenous hormone that they bind to the receptor, but are sufficiently different from the endogenous hormone that they don't just change the conformation of the receptor as the normal hormone does, but they do it better. And so either tweaking the conformation so it's even having even more of a biological effect in the target cell, or holding on to the receptor longer so that it has a greater biological effect on the cell. So we're going to call that an agonist. On the other hand, there are other drugs that people have come up with that are sufficiently like the endogenous hormone that they bind to the receptor, but unlike the genuine. Oh, and all of these, we can refer to them as being ligands, Ligand. So unlike the natural ligand, the hormone, when it binds to the receptor, it does not cause the receptor to take on that special change in conformation so that it becomes biologically active. And so it's binding to the receptor. In some cases, we'll call it an antagonist. In some cases, it binds to receptor better than the endogenous hormone and or longer, the endogenous hormone, and yet no biological activity takes place. By itself, that would have no effect. But if there are circulating molecules of the endogenous hormone around, then the reason the antagonist has an effect is because it prevents the hormone from binding and therefore prevents the biological activity of the hormone. And there are several antagonists that we'll be talking about in this class. One famous antagonist is tamoxifen, and it is an anti-estrogen. And for many years, it was a frontline defense for women with breast cancer, for example, or cervical cancer, or several other cancers, in those cases where they were estrogen sensitive. Not all cancers, such cancers, are estrogen sensitive, but many of them are. And so for many years, the anti-estrogen tamoxifen prolonged the lives and saved the lives of many women with cancer. Another, oh, yeah, and another antagonist we'll be talking about is this drug, RU486, which stands for, it was made by the Swiss pharmaceutical company, Roussel Uclof, and 486, it was a 486 compound they had fiddled around with. It turns out to be an antagonist at the progesterone receptor. Remember, I've told you that progesterone, released from the corpus luteum, its job is to maintain the endometrial lining of the uterus so that the embryo will eventually develop enough that it can start providing its own gonadotropins and maintain the uterus. So if you block that effect of progesterone by putting in RU486, then the progesterone, even though it's there, it can't get to the tissues in the endometrial lining, and therefore they respond as though there's no progesterone, and endometrial lining is shed along with any embryos that happen to be there. So this is a so-called abortion drug. And unlike many drugs that are called abortion drugs for political purposes, this one actually is. And in fact, the majority of abortions that are done in the United States these days are drug-induced through RU486. And we'll talk about that and changes in abortion and what that means in some detail later. Questions about that? And I guess I'll telegraph it to say, you will hear people refer to so-called Plan B as an abortion pill, and it is not, cannot possibly be. Plan B is just a really, really high dose of estrogen. And the only way it can work is to stop ovulation. No ovulation, no fertilization, no embryo. Okay? And we'll talk about in more detail how we know that in a bit. But it's sometimes called an abortion pill by people who want to mischaracterize it, because the truth is they're not just against abortion, they're against contraception. And you might ask yourself, why would somebody be against contraception? Okay, and we'll get there. Questions about any of that? Any other antagonists? There are also androgen antagonists. There's several of them. I didn't list them up there. Flutamide or hydroxyflutamide is probably the best one. And so when you give the drug, it binds to the androgen receptors, but it doesn't have the biological effect. And so the prostate, for example, gets smaller. The muscle mass may be affected because it's blocked androgen receptors in muscle. The beard doesn't get lighter, but it might grow more slowly. And to the extent that testosterone is driving hair loss and male pattern baldness, it may slow that process down. Then there are other drugs that are more complicated in the sense that if, for example, there are some drugs that bind to an enzyme and have to be converted from an inactive precursor to an active precursor. Okay? So, for example, what we'll see a lot of is that testosterone is normally a precursor for estrogen. So there are enzymes that bind to testosterone molecules, snip off, here it's shown that way, but put the testosterone molecule through an organic reaction that now converts it. It used to be testosterone and now it's estradiol. Everyone get that? We'll talk about that process quite a bit. That process of turning testosterone into estrogen is known as aromatization. And the enzyme that does it is aromatase, about which more later. So this is how things normally work, but one can come up with compounds that are enough like the normal, the endogenous version, that it binds to the enzyme, but now the enzyme can't convert it, can't snip off and convert it to the active hormone. And in this case, there are some drugs that are called aromatase inhibitors, and they are amazingly effective. By binding to the enzyme, they keep the endogenous compound from reaching it. And so the impact of aromatase inhibitors is they virtually stop estrogen production in the body. Bless you. Because the individual still make testosterone, but it can't get converted to estrogen. Everyone get that? And when I say it's amazingly effective, I mean, you give these drugs and you can virtually, you measure virtually no estradiol in circulation, even though you know the ovaries are there. And of course, the ovaries are making testosterone as a precursor to estrogen, but with the aromatase inhibited, they can't produce it.
Like blockers?
That's more complicated. We'll get there. I mean, I will just say that when we get to puberty blockers, the problem is that their action isn't easy to understand in any of these things. I mean, the puberty blockers, in fact, are GnRH agonists. And so how does that have the effect that it does? It's complicated, and I'm not sure that we actually understand. It's just, we just know it works, about which more later. What I thought you were going to ask is aromatase inhibitors are now the frontline defense for breast cancer. Because what people found was when you use an anti-estrogen like tamoxifen, it has its anti-estrogenic effects for a while, but somehow the tumors sometimes adapt, and now they are not inhibited by the antagonist, but now they're excited by it. So now they are what had been an anti-estrogen is now acting as an estrogen. So the frontline defense for breast cancers that are estrogen positive, which is most of them, the frontline defense now are aromatase inhibitors, where you don't make the estrogen in the first place. And so that way of driving the tumor is cut off. And apparently, the aromatase inhibitors remained effective as long as you take them. Questions about that? Another important enzyme inhibiting method is one that this drug known as Finasteride, or also known as Proscar. It is enough like testosterone that it binds to the androgen receptor, but it won't let an enzyme that normally converts testosterone to an even more powerful androgen, it stops that from working. So the person has plenty of testosterone around, but what we'll see later is that in certain parts of the body, including the prostate and the hair follicles on the scalp, there's an enzyme that converts testosterone to a more powerful androgen. And we'll be talking about that enzyme some more in a bit. And it converts the testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, which is even better than testosterone at acting on androgen receptors. And so finasteride is that chemical process, I'll show you the reaction in a moment, is known as 5α-Reductase, just referring to the organic chemistry terminology that's used because it's reducing the compound at the 5-alpha position. But so by inhibiting 5-alpha-reductase, it keeps testosterone from being converted to more powerful dihydrotestosterone. And it turns out your scalp and your prostate are full of 5-alpha-reductase. And you can think of 5-alpha-reductase as being a way that local tissues can amplify androgen signals. And so the problem with male pattern baldness is that testosterone gets to the scalp and locally there is converted to dihydrotestosterone, and it's dihydrotestosterone that causes the hair follicle to die. Not to make the man look ugly, but to make the man look old, and therefore, until recent times, make him look more attractive. How are you doing? Okay, so these are the sorts of compounds we'll run into. Now we're going to get back to the question of how it is there, honest. how we get from here to male and females being differently, developing differently, sexual differentiation. So we've already covered that the genetic sex, and in mammals, the chromosomal sex, determines whether the indifferent gonad will develop as a testis or an ovary. So we can say that genetic sex determines gonadal sex. And after that point, the gonads are going to direct sexual differentiation of the rest of the body, and they do so through the use of hormones. So genetic sex determines gonadal sex, and then it will be gonadal sex that determines phenotypic sex throughout the body when things go in the typical fashion. So the way it works in mammals is that if a testis develops, it secretes two hormones to defeminize the body, to prevent the Mullerian ducts from forming, and to masculinize the body. And we're going to talk about those. In contrast, the female gonad early in life, at least, doesn't seem to be putting out much hormone. And so it will be the absence of those two hormones made by testes that cause the body to develop in a female phenotype. So these experiments are, this understanding was worked out in the middle of the 20th century in experiments by a biologist named Alfred Jost, who was working in rabbits and sheep. And he was doing experiments. He was doing fetal surgery in these animals. And to a remarkable extent, what he discovered that happens in sheep and rats is what happens across all the mammals. There are very few exceptions to this, certainly not any among the placental mammals, which are most mammal species. What he found was that if he went to a female rabbit, sheep, rats, when he went to a female rabbit early in fetal development and removed the ovaries, the animal came out looking like a female, same as ever. On the other hand, when he went in and did such a surgery in males, when he removed their testes, when they came out, they had all the phenotype of a female. So they failed to masculinize. So that was his first hint that there was something coming out of the testes that was important for masculinizing the body. And in a strange experiment, he found that when he removed only one of the testes in the fetal male, then that side, without the testis, developed Mullerian duct structures. But on the other side, where the testis was intact, the Mullerian ducts were inhibited. And so this is how he realized that the testes were releasing something that acted only locally to inhibit Mullerian duct formation or maturation. Pardon? About one sex being the default sex, and guess which sex it is. Oh, yeah. You know, that's I mean, it's great to ask this now, and we're going to go a bit further, which is later we're going to see that testosterone is going to be important for masculinizing the Wolffian ducts. But let's think about that a little bit harder, okay? What you're really telling me is we happen to know two factors that are playing a role in the decision of making a male. Tell me, do you think there are fewer factors involved in making the oviduct, the uterus, the vagina? I mean, there are going to be just as many complicated factors, but you know what the difference is? In the 1950s, nobody had the genetic expertise to study that. What yeah, so what you're saying is we're going to call the male the more important or the fancier body because we happen to have identified two factors that are involved in that. But there are plenty of factors. They're not hormones, but they're genetic mechanisms. You cannot make a female reproductive tract just by, any old genes, right? They have to be the right sort of genes in the right place. They just don't happen to be driven by hormones. Yeah.
Systems and larger. So, like, yeah, the absence of two certain hormones leads to the fermentation of the bodies and the denaturation of the body, but the presence of those two hormones doesn't cause more things to happen. It just, as a matter of fact, yeah.
So you're saying that if you make the case that the female body is at least as complicated as the male body in order to work, right? Then it's not that one's less complex or more complex than the other, right? I mean, I think now, in fact, it's not easy to say, which body is more complex, right? But I'm going to agree with you in a moment. uh, but there is one enormous difference between males and females in reproduction, at least among the mammals, which is she has to have the machinery to successfully keep another individual inside her for 40 weeks. And that mechanism is very complicated. Actually, there are plenty of hormones involved in it. But in both cases, developing structures that work is always a complex process. It's just that in the females, that process is being mediated by genes, most of which we don't understand and don't know how they work. Whereas in males, that same gene pathway is being regulated, but it happens to be regulated by a factor we happen to know. Yeah. After the testes? The female came out, the genetic male came out looking like a female. Importantly, he was removing the testes pretty early. That is, as soon as he could tell them apart, as soon as he could tell that this is going to be a testis, right? That's when he removed it. He couldn't do it earlier because no one had genetic tests to tell him that that fetus had a Y chromosome or not. That would have been black magic at the time. Somebody else had a hand here, but yeah. So when the rabbit grew up, it had a female anatomy. It had the Mullerian duct structures. I'll talk about more. Did not have the Wolffian duct structures and was absolutely infertile. Had no way of reproducing because it had no system of delivering sperm, right? Plus, of course, had no testes. There were no sperm being made. Okay, so let's talk first about the protein hormone fetal testes secrete to suppress Mullerian duct structures. It went through several names, but these days the most common is anti-Mullerian hormone. So it's a protein peptide hormone. It is secreted by the testes. It acts fairly locally. So it has the testes have to be close to the Mullerian ducts in order for it to have its effect. That suggests that the hormone is broken down pretty quickly the further you get away from the source. So it's acting in what people sometimes refer to as a paracrine fashion. It's acting like a hormone, but only on tissues that are nearby. So in that case, when the testes are there and secreting anti-Mullerian hormones, the Mullerian ducts wither away and just about completely disappear. And as we're going to see in a moment, the Mullerian ducts are responsible for getting eggs to the outside world. They're responsible for making the oviduct, also known as fallopian tube, the uterus, and the interior portion of the vagina. So without those Mullerian ducts, males, don't have that. This is why males don't have an oviduct or a uterus or a vagina. In the absence of anti-Mullerian hormone, then the Mullerian duct structures change and grow into a female reproductive tract. And I would argue that the female reproductive tract is at least as complicated as the male reproductive tract. It doesn't happen by magic. It doesn't happen by default. It doesn't happen because, oh, as long as you stay out of the way, tissues always will organize themselves carefully. It happens because it's following a genetic program that happens to be controlled by a hormone. Yeah, sorry. Mhm.
Didn't have like ovum or anything, so did it?
Right. So when you remove the testis on one side, there was no chance for an ovary to come, right? Because the testis derived from the indifferent gonad, which is embryologically the same source as ovaries. So there was no chance for an ovary to be over there. Exactly. And yes, there were on that side, there was Mullerian ducts there. Okay. And as we'll see, and so we could say that the rabbit, when it came out, it had an intersex phenotype. It wasn't quite all male, not quite all female, right? Because it had mostly male stuff for most of its body, but on one side, it had these Mullerian ducts. Now, what I thought you were going to ask is what happened to the Wolffian ducts on that side? Because we haven't talked about that so far. But the second hormone that the testes secrete that acts on the Wolffian ducts are androgens, like testosterone. So the testes secrete testosterone, and it acts on the Wolffian ducts to make them turn into the male reproductive tract, which includes the epididymis, the vas deferens, and the seminal vesicles. So those are all going to come from the Wolffian ducts. And testosterone drives that differentiation. Interestingly, when he removed the testis on only one side of that fetal male, the Wolffian ducts developed on both sides, even though the testis was missing from one side. And that tells you that this hormone is acting in a fundamentally different way. It is getting into the bloodstream, and no matter where you put the testis, the hormone will get to its targets and masculinize them. Just like when Berthold in the 1800s castrated a cockerel and stuck the testis back inside it, it could be just about anywhere in the abdominal cavity. And as long as it got vascularized, the animal would come out masculine, look like a rooster. How you doing? So notice that the testosterone by itself has no effect on the Mullerian duct structures. It sometimes happens that a man is having abdominal surgery, and when they're poking around in there, they find that he has a uterus. What? He had no idea he had a uterus in there. And there's two different ways this can happen. Number one, he doesn't make functional AMH. So he's not making the anti-Mullerian hormones. And so the Mullerian ducts on that side go ahead and develop. Or the other thing that happens, what's the other thing that could cause that to happen in an XY individual? What's the other way the Mullerian ducts would fail to respond? Yeah. So this individual is XY, so they have a Y chromosome, which causes the testes to make the indifferent gonad to become testes, and either the testes can't secrete functional AMH or the receptor for AMH isn't working. And in a few cases, they've been able to take the genes and figure out that it's one versus the other. But this does not inhibit their fertility. And presumably, there are many men like this out there that never know it, because without someone looking inside, you'd have no way of knowing that they're carrying a uterus. But it also shows how independent these two processes are. Inhibition of the Mullerian ducts is quite independent from masculinization of the Wolffian ducts. And that's because they use different hormone mechanisms. In the absence of testosterone, the Wolffian ducts in XX individuals typically wither away. So they require testosterone or some sort of androgen in order to survive. Otherwise, those cells die. And you will see in the literature, you'll sometimes hear people talk about the development of the Wolffian ducts as being a virilization process. So here I'm just pointing out the differences. So the Mullerian ducts are making the oviduct, the uterus, the cervix, that part of the uterus, and the inner vagina. And the rest of the vagina is going to be formed by the skin out there in the perineal region. So it'll be cells there that form the opening of the vagina to connect to the Mullerian duct structure inside. And you'll hear people give different estimates of how much is interior and how much is exterior. And I don't care. I mean, it's a third, a half, 2/3. My guess is it's different in different individuals. But we know that the Mullerian duct structures are important because it will sometimes happen that someone will see a case where people may have a vagina that's kind of shallow because there's no Mullerian duct to provide the interior portion of it. So hold on to that. We'll get there in a moment. So the outer vagina is formed by genital skin. In the male reproductive tract, it's the epididymis, the epididymis where the sperm mature and store, the vas deferens that transports the sperm out to the urethra, and the seminal vesicles that provide most of the fluid that's going to be in semen. I haven't mentioned the prostate because the prostate is not derived from the Wolffian ducts. The prostate is developed from epithelial tissues, mesodermal tissues that are nearby, and they form under the influence of testosterone. So they too are beholden to testosterone to take the masculine pathway. How are you doing? Okay. Oh, and here, a few years back, some folks came up with antibodies that are specific to Mullerian ducts and Wolffian ducts. And so you can see here in these samples from gestational ages that keep going up, you can see number one, the ducts are getting bigger, right? That's just the growth of the embryo. But you can see how, in this case, the Wolffian ducts, of course, they made it blue. The Wolffian ducts are developing in this case, and the Mullerian ducts in a female, right? So male, it's the Wolffian ducts are coming along, and in females, the Mullerian ducts are oh yeah. The point of this is the Mullerian ducts are disappearing in the male, but they're coming along just fine in the female. And these were human embryos, so it was an accomplishment technically just to get that sort of material and to have the antibodies to see the difference. And let's see. So that's enough for the internal genitalia. Any questions about that? Sexual differentiation of the internal genitalia. The external genitalia, things are a little bit different. So again, early in fetal development, the 4th week of gestation, it says here, everybody's crotch looks the same, right? The perineal region looks the same in everyone. In both cases, there's a little swelling at the midline between the legs where the gut is coming out. And there is a little bump that arises that goes by several different names, but we can call it the genital tubercle. The idea being it's a tiny little tube. And eventually, the this, oh, and the opening, that's one opening for both the urethra and the anus, is known as a cloaca. Remember, I told you that in birds, that's all they have is a cloaca. They don't have a separate urethral opening and anal opening. It's all coming out together. So early in life, those are both conjoined there, but eventually they will diverge so that the more rostral part will become the urethra and the more caudal part will butt off and become the anus. And so that'll be the point where the reproductive tract, male or female, becomes separated from the gut. And up to 6 weeks of age, the development looks to be the same in both sexes. But after that, things will happen differently, so that in males, there will be more growth of the phallus, and the skin around there in that area, the perineal region, will start making a scrotum. Whereas in female, there's still growth of the clitoris, but it's not as marked. And the skin around that area, instead of making instead of making a scrotum, make the labia. And what we're trying to get across here is that these structures in this color, the yellow of the glands, is embryologically from the same tissue. And so it's just a matter of how much growth there was. And that growth is driven by testosterone. So in the presence of testosterone, it will grow to form a penis and a scrotum. And in the absence of testosterone, an equally complicated genetic program will form a female exterior, the clitoris, the outer parts of the vagina, and the labia. Notice that early, the urethra is not going out of the glands, but that's a process that happens later. As the male develops more, the urethra forms and eventually comes out the tip of the penis or close to it. That process is also driven by testosterone, and sometimes it doesn't quite complete. So there's a condition where the urethra opens before it gets to the tip of the glands. So in that case, there's a little slit where the urethra is open, and so the urine is going to come out here rather than at the tip. And in severe cases, the urethra may not get to the phallus at all. It may empty under the scrotum. This condition is known as hypospadias. So the urethra is coming out lower than it should. And in fact, if you look at lots of different glands' penis, the urethra doesn't always come out at the very tip, the way it does in all the diagrams we show. Sometimes it comes out close to the tip. And there's no evidence that this is of any consequence physiologically or in terms of fertility. Remember, I told you there are some cultures where the boys at puberty undergo subincision, where they deliberately make a cut at the base, at the undersurface of the penis to make it open there, and they reproduce just fine. So having urethra in this position may not impair fertility. Having urethra in that position, of course, would impair fertility. What you're going to ask, right? Right? Yeah. How would it come about the person would have two? You're thinking of the fellow with two penises? Oh,
Told us about this. We had 2 urethras.
I have no idea. I don't know. Uh-huh. Well, see, you could imagine that, I mean, so the tissue is closing over to form the urethra. You can imagine that if it closed over, in near the end, but not part way, that you'd have that sort of thing happen. So there weren't two urethras, but the one urethra had two openings. That would be my guess. Pardon? These are all examples of hypospadias, but if when the person has sex, the ejaculate comes out, doesn't come out inside the vagina, but comes out outside the vagina, then I wouldn't say that they can't possibly get pregnant, but that's going to make things more difficult. If he wants to have a family, of course, you could always use, other methods, right? Gather sperm and, um, and have someone inject the sperm into the uterus at the right time, so-called artificial insemination, about which we'll get to later. Here's another example, some other examples, and again, you can see how that wouldn't be a problem for reproducing. Now, this process of growth of the penis and of the urethra coming out at the tip of the penis, that process is driven by the enzyme we talked about earlier. So if this is the structure of testosterone, there is an enzyme called 5α-Reductase that chemically reduces that compound in a single step to a slightly different compound, which is known as dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. And like testosterone, DHT binds to the androgen receptor, but unlike testosterone, DHT binds to the androgen receptor longer. And so by binding to it longer, the steroid receptor complex exists longer, and therefore it can regulate gene expression longer. And so it will amplify any androgenic effects. There is some 5-alpha-reductase everywhere, but certain tissues in the body are really rich in 5-alpha-reductase. So you should regard these areas as those where natural selection has provided a local androgen amplification system. You get the testosterone there, and the testosterone will act on androgen receptors, but when it gets 5-alpha reduced to dihydrotestosterone, the biological effect will be enhanced. And among those tissues where there's loads of 5-alpha reductase includes that whole genital area we talked about before. And so the testes release testosterone. The testosterone goes all over the body, of course, but when it gets to those tissues, its effect is amplified. So, questions about that? Oh, and the other place where there's loads of 5-alpha reductase is in the scalp. So when men develop male pattern baldness, it's because they're making testosterone, and of course they've been making testosterone for a while, but it takes a while for the pattern baldness to appear, and that gets amplified by 5-alpha reductase. So if you inhibit 5-alpha reductase, you can impair that process. And so there are drugs that have 5-alpha reductase inhibitors that you can rub into the skin in the scalp of limited success. And then there are other drugs that you take orally that go everywhere to inhibit 5-alpha reductase. Those drugs, in addition to delaying or maybe even stopping male pattern baldness, will also cause the prostates to start getting smaller. Sometimes people take the drug not because they're trying to avoid baldness, but because they have reason to want the prostate to stop growing so much. Questions about that? Okay, so here's where we are so far. Testicular hormones masculinize the body, and in the absence of those signals, the body takes on a female phenotype. AMH will inhibit the Mullerian ducts, testosterone will virilize the Wolffian ducts, and in the exterior, 5-alpha reductase will amplify the testosterone effect, to cause the genital skin to form a scrotum and penis. So I said that genetic sex determines gonadal sex, and gonadal sex determines phenotypic sex, but the vehicle for gonadal sex to affect phenotypic sex is hormone. So the testes make testosterone, and that masculinizes the penis, scrotum, etc. It also makes anti-Mullerian hormone. I don't know what happened to my arrow. And in the absence of testosterone, clitoris, labia, Mullerian ducts come about, and the AMH is going to prevent the Mullerian duct development. Here's another chart that I'm not going to go over that's trying to fill in more of the details, but the basic message is the same. Genetic sex determines gonadal sex, and gonadal sex determines phenotypic sex. And here we're seeing the hormones that are important for masculinizing those characteristics. Questions about, yeah. Yeah. Oh, you mean, how is it inherited? It is an X-linked trait. And so for when men do show male pattern baldness, who'd they get their X chromosome from? Mom. They've only got one, and she's the only one that could give it to him, right? And so, it is linked to that, and therefore, his chances of being bald someday have nothing to do with what his dad looks like. Rather, find out about his mother's brothers and her dad. Now, her dad may or may not have had male pattern baldness because he had two X chromosomes to give to the mom. Granddad did, and you don't know which one he gave. One might have the male pattern baldness gene and the other one not. But her uncles, they're a pretty good indication, though again, because their gene came from mom. But wait a minute, mom's got two genes too. So, maybe the uncle's got the good gene, but there was a bad gene in there and he happened to get that one. Life is full of risk, right? Be sure to, did someone tell you should have been very careful filling out the form before you got here. You should have checked all the right boxes. Okay. Last one, and then we'll do a Kahoot. So the descent of the testes is also facilitated by androgens, though it's not so totally dependent on that. And in the most part, here's showing you that we told you before, the testes are up here by the kidneys, where they were embryologically. And and in females, of course, the gonads are going to stay up there, close to the kidneys, right behind the kidneys. But in males, there's this structure called the gubernaculum that serves to pull down the testes into the developing scrotum. And eventually, the muscle tissue around this, so there's a tube here, we're not showing it to you, eventually it will become small enough that the testes can't get back up. So they're now stranded, which is a good thing, in the scrotum, where there's lower temperature than the rest of the body, which is important for spermatogenesis. So this means that typically the testis descent to the scrotum is a one-way trip, right? It goes down. And after that, the opening is too small for the testes to go back. Although it sometimes happens that someone will have an injury where the testes are jammed into that spot. And if they remain there, sometimes the testes can die. And at the very least, there won't be much spermatogenesis there. And so that requires a trip to the doctor, right? And they may have to do surgery to get the testis dislodged. It also sometimes happens that the process is incomplete at birth. So there'll be an undescended testis. And early in life, it's sometimes possible to physically get the testes down into the scrotum. And one can decide to do that. If it's only one testis that has failed to descend, it's not really the end of the world, right? I mean, the individual will have one testis up there in the abdomen. They'll have very little spermatogenesis, but they still got another testis that's still making millions of sperm every day. And they'll still have just as much testosterone and stuff like that. Ready for a Kahoot? Yeah. So this chart is meant to show you what the normal course of events are in the steroid exposure of an individual that grows up. There is, in males and females, we're keeping track of two different hormones. The primary gonadal hormone for males is testosterone, and the primary gonadal hormone for females, at least during fetal development, is estrogen. And there's a very different trajectory of exposure. So in fetal development, as I told you, there's not much secretion from the ovaries at all. But as pregnancy continues, the ovaries do start producing testosterone. Importantly, pregnant women are full of testosterone. And so, in fact, all embryos are exposed to estrogen before birth. In fact, quite a lot of it. But in females, they're actually making some of their own. Whereas in males, they make a lot of testosterone in the first to middle trimester. Interestingly, this is being driven not by their GnRH, but this is being driven by the gonadotropins from the placenta. So it's human HCG that drives the developing testis to start producing testosterone. And the developing ovary early in development doesn't respond, but as pregnancy continues, the gonadotropins being produced by the placenta will start driving ovarian secretion there. Then at birth, during the birth process, there's a spike in testosterone actually in both sexes, but it's much more pronounced in males than in females. And within a week or so, it's gone. And likewise, after birth, in females that get exposed to estrogen for a while, they're no longer getting estrogen from their mom, but females are being exposed to their own estrogen. Then all gonadal steroids are quiescent until you reach puberty, where guys undergo puberty and have more or less constant testosterone after that, and females undergo menses and eventually reach menopause. So among parts of the body that are masculinized, it turns out the brains of males and females are not quite the same either. And so here's a relatively recent view that they talk about in chapter 4, where some parts of the cortex are larger in one sex than the other. But these are averages across a lot of people. You cannot, looking at these sorts of comparisons, you cannot accurately tell whether the person happens to be a man or a woman. But the fact that there are these differences there suggests that it may have something to do with different sex differences in behavior. And we'll return to that topic later. I just wanted to deal with it because it's in this chapter. So let's get back to disorders of sex development. One way that we know, before SRY was discovered, one way we knew that the Y chromosome was important for male development was that it occasionally happens that a baby is born where it gets an X chromosome from mom, but the sperm from dad didn't carry either an X or a Y. It turns out as you know, those of you who have a Y chromosome, you don't need two X chromosomes to survive. So the fetus survives, but it's born with only one X chromosome instead of two, which is okay. They've got a copy of all the genes one needs on an X chromosome. And this condition is sometimes referred to as XO, or sometimes referred to as Turner syndrome. Because while the condition is not fatal, right, the embryo develops, anytime you have a chromosomal aberration, it's going to affect development in lots of places, including gametogenesis, which is to say meiosis, right? So when meiosis has to happen and there's the dealing with the chromosomes, they often fail to produce viable ovaries. There are other conditions that are seen in the body. Such people tend to be short. They may have a little bit of webbing at the neck, and there can be mild to significant intellectual disability. So without a Y chromosome, female gonad, female body. On the other hand, having two X chromosomes and a Y, or even having three X chromosomes and having a Y, still results in a male phenotype. So it's the presence of the Y chromosome that causes the testes to develop, the testes then secrete the two hormones, and the body develops in a male-like fashion. These individuals too tend to have problem making sperm, not entirely infertile, but subfertile. And there are other consequences of the chromosomal composition, which is they tend to be rather tall. They tend to have low testosterone, and that causes several things. Because they don't make very much testosterone, their puberty is more delayed. And so their long bones continue to grow because the cessation of growth of the long bones is driven by gonadal steroids. And so in the absence of enough gonadal steroid secretion, they continue to grow a little bit longer before the epiphyses, the growing parts of bones, stop and height and body size is determined. The other consequence of not having very much testosterone is they may have gynecomastia, which is female-like breast development. So it turns out that the development of externalized breasts is sensitive to both testosterone and estrogen. And in general, the higher the ratio of estrogen to testosterone, the more breast development will happen. So in these cases, because their testosterone levels are low, there is some development of breasts. The low testosterone also is probably contributing to the spermatogenesis, to low sperm count, because as you know, testosterone is required to drive spermatogenesis. I did not include these photographs in your notes, and I'll take the time to talk about that, which is these sorts of photographs have been very common in the clinical literature. And to show in class, I'm comfortable showing you these, right? But it turns out when you talk to these people, when other people have gone to talk to individuals that had their picture taken like this, and they're often surprised at how widely distributed these pictures are in books, etc. And when you tell them that their face was obscured by a black bar, that doesn't help. They still sort of feel like, an invasion of their privacy. And for the most part, their parents who gave permission for these pictures didn't really realize how widely used they might be. So I try to avoid showing these pictures, putting these pictures online where they can be reproduced, but I'll show them to you here. And as I recall, I don't remember if the book has any of these photographs or not, but anyway. But everything I just told you, that these individuals tend to be short, and these individuals tend to be tall, and these individuals tend to have gynecomastia, I could have told you all that, and you'd know exactly what it would look like. But For completion, I do this. So here's a young man with Klinefelter syndrome. You can see he's sort of tall, but otherwise totally masculine. Here's an individual with Turner syndrome. And the reason the book zeroes in on her is that while, yes, she has the short stature that's common of Turner syndrome, she's not intellectually disabled because she's a physician, right? So the degree of intellectual disability can vary greatly, and that tends to get lost sometimes. Okay, questions about that? Another condition that we can talk about, it sometimes happens that a person, an XY individual is born whose androgen receptor gene is dysfunctional. And so if it's an XY individual, the indifferent gonads will develop as choose XY. So they'll make testes. The testes will make testosterone. The testes will make anti-Mullerian hormone, and that will suppress the Mullerian ducts, right? And the testes will make testosterone, which normally would masculinize every other structure. But in the absence of a functional androgen receptor, the body doesn't respond. And so what happens is the gonads develop as testes, the Mullerian ducts are missing, but the Wolffian ducts never get the signal, and therefore they wither away. And the exterior looks like a female, because while the testosterone's there, the tissues can't respond to it. In extreme cases, we have what's known as complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, or AIS. And in the complete form, the individuals at birth are rarely recognized, right? So the baby comes out, the doctor does an extremely sensitive scientific test, that i.e. looks to see if there's a penis there or not, and declares it's a girl. And the individual is raised as a girl and may be perfectly happy as a girl, looks like all the other girls, but come puberty, her menses doesn't start. How come? Why no menstruation? Why no period? Well, there's no ovaries, right? So there's no cyclical ovarian hormones. And there's no uterus because the AMH was there and worked. So there's no uterus. And in fact, it will turn out, and she may have noticed this, she has a shallow vagina because she has only the exterior contribution to the vagina. And so these individuals go to the doctor because everybody else is having their period. How come I'm not? And the doctor will do an exam, first do a vaginal exam, and the first thing he'll see is there's no cervix there. And he may take a blood sample and find that this individual has very high levels of testosterone, higher than in normal males. And if he takes a karyotype, he'll see the individual has a Y chromosome. And so these individuals cannot reproduce. And we'll talk about that condition some more in a bit. I guess I'll go as far as to say there are individuals with this syndrome. Here's an example in the book. And here, these women all have AIS, part of a support group. Here are two more women. And there's a couple of people that have talked about it. And there's a pretty great memoir by this young lady that she titled Inverse Cowgirl that has this condition. These individuals tend to look quite feminine, and they tend to behave quite feminine, which suggests that any effect of testosterone in masculinizing the look of the face, for example, they may have large breasts, they have a very feminine looking face. We haven't talked about that a lot, but notice how narrow the chin is, et cetera. And she points out that all her life, people have been telling her how pretty she is, but she has a Y chromosome and she was born with testes. Now then, because I'm a little bit offended at people leaving,